Rain slapped the tin roof of the tow yard like fists, and Officer Grady Lemon watched his partner Beacon lock up at the far fence, every muscle stiff, every breath hissing through his teeth. The shepherd wasn't scratching. He was cutting into the wet gravel like something under it was calling his name. Grady set his coffee down. He knew that sound. He'd heard it in a collapsed barn near Coshocton once, right before Beacon pulled a man from a beam. It meant somebody was still breathing, somewhere. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what part of the world you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. The problem was that behind the fence, there was nothing but junk. Twisted bumpers stacked like broken teeth, a truck axle rusted straight through, a hill of old washing machines with their doors gaping like open mouths. And behind all of it, the crooked shed of Alvin Brenner, the man who ran the yard. Grady had known Alvin 12 years, since Alvin's mother had died and left him the plot on the edge of Millbrook, Ohio. 12 years of nods at the diner. 12 years of Alvin refilling his own coffee at the counter and never quite looking anybody in the eye. Grady had chalked it up to grief and left him alone. That was going to be his first mistake. He tried to call Beacon off, whistled twice, slapped his thigh. The shepherd didn't even glance up. That refusal, more than the digging itself, put a cold seed in Grady's chest. Beacon didn't disobey. Beacon had come out of a canine program in Columbus with a trainer named Mr. Wilkes, who said the dog was the most careful animal he'd ever watched work. And in 3 years, Grady had never once had to raise his voice at him. Not once. And now Beacon was digging like the earth had wronged him. Alvin appeared at the gate before Grady had crossed the road. He came at a fast walk, wiping his hands on a shop rag, and his mouth was already smiling. That was the second thing Grady noticed. The smile arrived too fast. It arrived before the situation had earned any smile at all. It arrived and then it stayed, stretched a little wider than a friendly mouth ought to stretch, and it stayed, while Alvin said, "Real easy, officer. Everything all right out here? That dog of yours must have smelled a possum." Grady kept his own face pleasant. He said Beacon didn't dig for possums. He asked if there was anything back there he ought to know about. Alvin laughed, a bark of a laugh that jumped a half-second too late, and said no, just scrap, been scrap since his daddy's time. Grady asked about the flyer, the little Ashford girl. Riley, 11 years old, walked home from softball practice on a Tuesday and never made it past the bridge. Alvin shook his head, and this time the smile didn't move. Not the corners of it, not the eyes above it. Grady had spent 17 years reading faces, and a smile that didn't shift with the words behind it was a smile with something to hide. He thanked Alvin. He got in the cruiser. He whistled Beacon in through the open passenger door, and Beacon came, but slow, looking back over his shoulder the whole time, ears flat against his skull. Grady drove out with the shepherd panting hot against the window and the tow yard shrinking in the mirror. And he already knew he was not going to sleep that night. He did not sleep. He did not sleep for 2 weeks. Grady's kitchen table filled up with the Riley Ashford file until his wife would have complained if he'd had one. But Grady's wife had left him 9 years ago and taken the good curtains with her, and now the table was just his and Beacon's. The file was thin, which was the cruelest part. A photograph of Riley on picture day, freckled, gap-toothed, laughing at something the photographer had said. A description of the green jacket her mother had sewn a patch onto the night before she vanished. A patch shaped like a maple leaf because Riley collected them off the sidewalk after school. A list of every road walked, every ditch checked, every bridge dredged. The Millbrook River had been swept twice. The woods off Route 40 had been swept 3 times. 3 counties had sent volunteers with dogs and drones and calling voices. Nothing. Not a shoe. Not a hair. Not a footprint. It was like the earth had folded open and swallowed her without leaving a seam. Grady read the file until the pages went soft at the corners. He read the mother's statement over and over. Delphine Ashford, 36 years old, worked the day shift at the Millbrook Elementary cafeteria, single since Riley's father had walked out when the baby was still in diapers. Delphine had said in her statement that Riley was a good girl, that Riley was careful, that Riley knew the rule about the bridge and never crossed it alone. And Delphine had said at the very bottom of the page, in a shaky handwriting note that Sergeant Miriam Cordero had transcribed as an afterthought, "Please, please, please find my little girl." Every time Grady read that line, his eyes burned, and Beacon put his heavy head on Grady's knee and did not move. Beacon began to whine at the cruiser door every time they passed the Brenner Road. Every time. Not a bark. A whine, low in his throat. A whine that made the hair go up on the back of Grady's neck, because it was the same whine Beacon made in Coshocton before he pulled that man out from under the beam. And every time Grady drove past, he saw the shed and the fence and the mound of washing machines, and behind them in the far corner, the patch of gravel where Beacon had been cutting. On a Thursday evening, Grady turned in without a warrant. He told himself he was just walking his dog. He told himself he'd knock, ask again about the flyer, be polite, back off. He put Beacon on the lead and walked up the drive with his hat in his hand, and Alvin came out of the shed with a shotgun cradled loose in his arm and told him he was trespassing. Alvin's voice was flat now, no smile, no laugh, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had already decided what he would do if pushed. Grady raised both hands slow, back to the cruiser, and drove away with his heart hammering the inside of his shirt. He filed a report that night. He sat across the desk from Sergeant Miriam Cordero, 49 years old, 21 years on the force, a woman who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and did not suffer fools, and he laid it out. The dog, the smile, the shotgun, the whine. Miriam listened. Miriam always listened. That was the thing about her. And then Miriam took off the reading glasses and let them dangle and said, "Grady, a dog digging is not probable cause. A man's smile is not probable cause. A man on his own property with a lawful firearm telling a trespassing officer to leave is not probable cause. Bring me something, bring me one thing, and I will get you a warrant so fast the ink will steam." Grady sat in his cruiser in the station parking lot for a long time. He watched the streetlight buzz on and off. He watched Beacon in the back seat, sitting up straight, staring at him with amber eyes that seemed to be waiting for an answer. And Grady understood, sitting there, that he was going to lose this. Riley would stay a face on a flyer. Delphine would keep making sandwiches at the elementary cafeteria and putting the third plate away every night because that was what mothers did. And Alvin Brenner would keep smiling too fast at the diner counter, and Grady would keep drinking his coffee 2 stools down, and both of them would know, and neither of them would say. That was when Beacon leaned forward and put his head over the seat and set his chin on Grady's shoulder, warm, heavy, certain. Grady closed his eyes and remembered something Mr. Wilkes had said back in Columbus, the day he'd handed Beacon over. Mr. Wilkes had been a Vietnam medic before he was a dog trainer, and he'd said it the way medics say things, with no wasted words. He'd said, "Officer Lemon, a shepherd like this doesn't lie. People lie. Shepherds don't. If he tells you a thing is a thing, that thing is a thing. Your job is to catch up." Grady drove home. He fed Beacon. He sat on his porch in the cold and stared at the dark and thought about caramels. He didn't know yet why he was thinking about caramels. He just was. He called Delphine Ashford at 9:30 in the morning the next day. He apologized for the hour, and she said, "No, no, no, don't apologize, ask." And her voice had that thin, cracked hopefulness that people get when they have been waiting to be asked. Grady swallowed. He said, "Mom, this is going to sound strange. Did Riley ever ride her bike out past the bridge, toward the tow yard?" The silence lasted a long breath, long enough that Grady thought the line had dropped. Then Delphine said, Oh, and it was a small O, and it came out like the sound a person makes when they've been holding a shard of glass in their hand for weeks, and finally opened the fist. She said she wasn't supposed to. I told her not to. But there was a man out there. She said he had cats. She said he was lonely and he had cats, and she brought him kittens when she found strays behind the school, and he gave her caramels. I told her not to. Officer, I told her not to. Grady closed his eyes. He said, Mom, listen, this isn't your fault. This isn't your fault. He said it twice because he could hear her starting to shake on the other end of the line, and he needed her not to shake. He needed her steady because he was about to ask her the thing that mattered. He said, do you remember his name? She said, I think it was the Brenner man. From the yard. Grady drove to Miriam's house at 11 at night. He did not call first. Miriam opened the door in a bathrobe with her reading glasses on top of her head and a mug of decaf in her hand, and she took one look at Grady's face and stepped aside and let him in without a word. Her husband was already in bed. The house smelled like cinnamon and the leftover of dinner. Miriam sat him down at her kitchen table under a yellow overhead light and said, Talk. He talked. He talked for 40 minutes. The dog, the smile, the shotgun, the caramels, the mother's O on the phone. When he was done, Miriam sat still for a long time, and then she picked up the phone and called Judge Prentice at his home number, and Grady heard her say the words probable cause, and the words missing child, and the words witness statement, and by 6 in the morning they had a warrant. And by 7:30 they had 4 cruisers pulled up along the Brenner Road with their bar lights spinning silent in the mist. Alvin came out of the shed with the shotgun in his hands, and this time he did not smile at all. He stood there for a long moment with the barrel angled at the ground, and Grady watched his shoulders and thought, please, please don't make this be the other kind of morning. Then Alvin let the shotgun drop into the gravel and put his hands on top of his head, and he sat down slow, and he did not fight when they cuffed him. Beacon went straight past the axle. He went past the washing machines. He went past the shed. He went to a patch of gravel Grady had not even noticed the first time, a patch tucked in the far corner behind an old chest freezer half hidden by a tarp. And he sat, ears up, tongue out, waiting. They dug. The mist thinned. The sun came up watery and cold. About 3 feet down, an officer named Purvis lifted a small green jacket out of the wet earth and held it up in both hands like something religious. The patch was still stitched on, crooked, a maple leaf sewn by a mother's hand the night her daughter walked home from softball and did not come home. Grady dropped to one knee. He couldn't help it. He put a hand on Beacon's shoulder and said, good boy, into the shepherd's ear, and Beacon closed his eyes for a moment and leaned into it. But it was not over, because Beacon had not brought them to that jacket. Beacon had brought them past that jacket. Beacon was still sitting 10 yards further on, staring at the chest freezer under the tarp with a look on his face Grady had never quite seen before. They pulled the tarp off. The freezer was old, avocado green, the kind that had lived in somebody's basement for 30 years before it got dragged out here to die. It was chained shut with a padlock. The vent on the back was jammed with a folded piece of plastic, but not all the way. A tiny gap, a crack that a person had left on purpose maybe, or a crack that had opened by accident. Grady would think about that crack for the rest of his life. They cut the padlock. Grady lifted the lid himself. He did not let anybody else lift it. And inside, curled up small, wearing the same clothes she'd worn to softball practice 15 days earlier, was Riley Ashford. Thin, filthy, colder than any living thing had a right to be. Breathing. He said her name. He said, Riley, honey, sweetheart, I'm Officer Lemon. You're all right. You're all right. You're safe now. Her eyes cracked open. They were the same eyes as the picture day photograph, just tired, just so tired. Her lips moved. He bent his ear down, and she said in a whisper made of dust, "Is the dog here?" He said, "Yes, honey, the dog is here." He carried her out himself. He would not let anybody else carry her. She weighed less than she should have, and her head fell against his shoulder like a child asleep in the car. And behind him, Beacon walked, steady and close, right at his heel, brushing his flank against Grady's leg the whole way to the ambulance. The paramedics took her. Miriam took the crime scene. Purvis took Alvin. Grady stood in the middle of the tow yard with rain starting up again and washing the gravel dark, and he shook so hard he had to put a hand on the cruiser to stay upright. That should have been the ending. It wasn't. Riley spent 4 nights at Millbrook General. Delphine slept in the chair beside her, one hand on the blanket, one hand always on the blanket, as if the moment she let go, the world might try again. Riley slept, woke, drank water through a straw, slept. On the second morning, she opened her eyes and said, in a voice you could barely hear, "Is the dog who found me still around?" And the nurse, a woman named Constance Whitaker, who had worked pediatric intensive care for 22 years and had seen too much and was known for having a spine of iron, went out into the hall and looked at Beacon leaning against Grady's leg and said, "Come on then, both of you, right now." Beacon walked to the bed. He did not jump up. He knew better. He put his chin on the sheet by Riley's small hand and closed his eyes. Riley's hand crept out and found his ear and did not let go. Delphine started to cry and could not stop, and Grady, 42 years old and not a crier since his own mother's funeral, wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the ceiling and thanked, silently, a God he had half stopped believing in. He thought that was the end. He was wrong, because on the 3rd night at the hospital, Riley was strong enough to sit up, and on the 3rd night at the hospital, Riley started to talk, and the first thing she said, once she got past the dog and the caramels and the man at the yard, was, "There was another one." Grady felt his stomach drop straight through the floor of the room. He said, "Honey, what did you say?" Riley looked at him with those tired, freckled eyes and said, "There was another kid, in the freezer, before me. He was sick. He talked to me at first and then he stopped talking. I don't know his name." Grady sat down. He sat down because his knees would not hold him. Delphine had gone quiet. Delphine's hand had gone tight on the blanket. Constance, the nurse, was standing in the doorway with a chart, and her chart was hanging forgotten at her side. Grady swallowed and said, "Sweetheart, when?" When did he stop talking? Riley thought. Riley said, "Before you found me, a while before." Miriam came within 20 minutes. She came in her civilian clothes, with her hair not quite combed, and she stood at the foot of Riley's bed with her arms folded tight across her chest. And Riley, brave girl, told her the same thing. And Miriam said, "Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you. You are the bravest person in this whole town." And then Miriam walked Grady out into the hall and closed the door behind them and stood with her forehead pressed against the wall for a full minute before she could speak. She said, "We go back tomorrow. We go back at first light, and we dig the whole thing." They went back at first light. They took cadaver dogs from Columbus, 3 of them, plus Beacon, who would not leave Grady's side no matter what he was asked. They went over the tow yard in a grid. They ran ground-penetrating radar across every patch that wasn't buried under scrap. They pulled up sections of concrete behind the shed. And in a corner, Grady had walked past twice. Not 15 feet from the freezer where they had pulled Riley out, they found a second buried freezer. Older, rustier, and inside it, wrapped in an old canvas tarp, they found what was left of a boy who had been missing from Findlay, Ohio, 2 years and 3 months. His name had been Marcus Kellerman. He had been 10 years old when he vanished from a strip mall parking lot on a Saturday afternoon. His mother had put up flyers for a year. Then she had put up new flyers. Then she had stopped, not because she'd given up, but because there was nobody left in the county who hadn't already seen his face. Grady sat on the running board of the cruiser and put his head between his knees and did not throw up, though he wanted to. Beacon stood beside him, panting, patient, and after a while, Beacon lay down in the wet gravel beside his boot and put his chin on Grady's ankle and stayed there. Miriam knelt down and said, "We got him, Grady. We got him. Because of you. Because of that dog. We got him. Two families that were waiting. We got him for both of them." Grady said, "I should have gotten him sooner." Miriam said, "No, you got him now. That is what you got. Don't turn a save into a failure. You hear me? Don't do that." Grady lifted his head. He looked at her. He said, "I hear you." He didn't believe her yet, but he heard her. The town of Millbrook did not know what to do with itself. Millbrook was 7,000 people, and one grocery and 2 churches and a diner called Sadie's, where everybody sat on the same stools every morning. And Alvin Brenner had sat on his stool for 20 years, and now the stool was empty, and the whole town looked at it and looked away and looked back and did not know where to put their eyes. There were people who cried. There were people who said they'd always known there was something off about that man. There were people who said, and this was the ugliest chorus, that Delphine Ashford should have watched her daughter better. Grady heard that one at the diner the second week after the arrest from a man named Cyril Boaz, who ran the hardware store, and Grady got up off his stool and walked over to Cyril Boaz and said, in a voice so quiet the whole diner heard it, "If I ever hear you say that again, in this town, in front of that woman or behind her back, I will personally walk you out of that shop and lock the door. Do you understand me, Cyril?" Cyril understood him. Cyril did not say it again, but something else was starting to happen, and it was starting to happen quietly, and Grady did not see it at first. Alvin Brenner had a sister. Her name was Marjorie Halstead. She lived in a farmhouse 30 minutes outside Millbrook with a husband who drove a beet truck and 3 grown sons, and she had not spoken to her brother in 11 years since their mother had died, and Alvin had gotten the tow yard, and Marjorie had gotten a set of dishes and a grievance. That was the story around town. That was the story Grady had heard. The story around town was wrong. The story around town was wrong because on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after Riley Ashford had come home, a woman with Marjorie Halstead's face and Marjorie Halstead's driver's license walked into the Millbrook Public Library and asked the librarian, a soft, round, kind woman named Eleanor Purdy, whether the newspapers from a certain summer 16 years ago were available on microfilm. Eleanor Purdy said, "Of course, honey. Are you writing something?" Marjorie Halstead did not answer. Marjorie Halstead sat down at the microfilm machine, and she stayed there for 4 hours, and when she left, her eyes were red and her hands were shaking, and she did not check anything out. Eleanor Purdy told Grady about it 3 days later at the diner, because that was how Millbrook worked, and Grady put down his fork and said, "Miss Purdy, could you show me what she was looking at?" Eleanor said, "Well, honey, I don't know exactly, but the machine remembered where she'd been." The machine remembered, and what the machine remembered was a story that had run in the Millbrook Gazette in the summer of the year Marjorie Halstead turned 19, a story about a girl named Louise Marder, who had disappeared from the Brenner tow yard while playing behind her father's parked wrecker. Louise Marder had been 8 years old. Louise Marder had never been found. The case had gone cold in 6 weeks because the search had been small, and the county sheriff back then had been Alvin and Marjorie's uncle, and there had never been anything printed about the tow yard being searched at all. Grady read the article 3 times. Then he called Miriam. Miriam called Columbus. Columbus sent a team back to the tow yard with more radar. This time they went not to the corner behind the shed, but to the plot of ground under the shed itself. And that was where they found the 3rd freezer and the 4th and the 5th. And Grady stopped going out to the yard because Miriam looked at him and said, "You don't need to be here for this part." And Grady, for the first time in his life on the job, did what a superior told him without arguing. Marjorie Halstead was arrested 6 weeks later for aiding and abetting after the fact for a sum of 16 years past. She did not deny it. Her lawyer entered a plea, and in the pre-trial motions, she gave a statement that made Grady sit down at his kitchen table with Beacon at his feet and read it 4 times in a row. Marjorie said she had walked into the shed as a 19-year-old girl and seen her brother standing over the body of Louise Marder. Marjorie said her brother had cried and begged and said he had not meant to. It had been an accident. The little girl had been climbing on the wrecker and had slipped, and now, if anyone knew, he would go to prison, and their mother would die of the shame, and everything their family had would be gone. Marjorie said she had believed him. Marjorie said she had helped him bury the child in a freezer under the shed. Marjorie said in her statement that she had not slept a full night in 16 years. Marjorie said that a year after Louise, she had gone back to the tow yard and asked her brother if he had done anything else, and he had said no, and she had believed him again, and she would keep believing him for another 15 years until she saw Riley Ashford's face on the news being carried out of the freezer he had put her in, and understood that everything she had done to protect her family had, in fact, been the thing that made her family into a monster. Grady read that statement and closed the file and sat with his hand on Beacon's neck for a long time, and Beacon did not move, and outside the porch light his own small yard was quiet, and he thought about a 19-year-old girl in a summer 16 years ago choosing wrong, and about the way one wrong choice makes the next wrong choice easier, and about the way a shepherd doesn't lie because a shepherd doesn't know how, and about the way people do. The trial did not happen for 8 months. That was another thing Grady had not expected. He had thought in some corner of his heart that once you found the girl alive, and the boy dead, and the sister confessing, the world would move fast. It did not. The world moved with paperwork and postponements and defense motions and prosecutor caution and jury selection and expert testimony about padlocks and vents and cadaver dogs, and Grady spent those 8 months trying to be the officer he had been before all of this, driving his rounds, drinking his coffee, patting Beacon on the flank, and pretending that a small green jacket wasn't stitched into the back wall of his skull. Riley was in school again by autumn. Delphine walked her to the door of Millbrook Elementary every morning, and Delphine did not let go of her hand until Riley let go first, and every teacher there watched them, and none of them said a word about it. Delphine had gone back to work at the cafeteria after 4 weeks. She had gone back because they needed the money, and because if she sat in the house one more day, she was going to lose her mind. Grady drove past the school every morning at 8:15, whether it was on his route or not, and he saw the two of them walking up the sidewalk, and Riley always looked up and waved at the cruiser, and Beacon always sat up in the passenger seat and pressed his nose against the glass. But the trial was coming, and something in Grady kept saying, "This is not over yet. This is not over yet. This is not over yet." He was right. Because 2 months before the trial was set to start, on a Tuesday night in February, Grady's cruiser was rammed from behind on the county road out past the Ashford place. He was not on patrol. He was driving Delphine and Riley home from a therapist's appointment in the next town over, because the therapist Miriam had recommended was 2 counties away, and Delphine did not own a car that would make the trip, and Riley had asked Grady, in her small voice, whether he would drive her, and Grady had said, "Of course, honey." Beacon was in the back seat between Riley and Delphine, and Riley was asleep with her head on Beacon's shoulder, and Delphine was staring out at the dark fields, and Grady had just turned onto the empty stretch past the old dairy when the truck came out of nowhere and hit them from behind and sent the cruiser spinning across the ice. They stopped in the ditch. The airbag punched the wind out of him. Beacon was barking. Riley was screaming. Delphine had one arm across Riley and the other braced against the door. Grady got the cruiser radio in his hand and got out one call, Cruiser 6309 off the road, request assistance, and then he saw the headlights of the truck cutting across the road again, and he understood. He got out of the car, he got Beacon out. He put himself between the truck and the back door where Riley and Delphine were, and he unholstered his sidearm, and he did not raise it, not yet, and the truck door opened, and a young man got out. 22 maybe, skinny, wearing a jacket too thin for the cold. And Grady, in that half-second, recognized the youngest of Marjorie Halstead's 3 grown sons. The boy was crying. That was what Grady would remember. The boy was crying and holding a tire iron and shaking so hard he could barely stand up straight. And he said, "You can't do this to my family. You can't do this to my mum. You can't take her." And Grady lowered the sidearm all the way down and said, "Son, son, put the tire iron down, please, son. Put it down." The boy did not put it down. The boy took a step forward. Beacon, at Grady's heel, made a sound so low and quiet it wasn't quite a growl. It was a warning without noise. It was every cell of a 5-year-old shepherd saying, "Take one more step. Take one more step and I will not let you have him." The boy took another step. Beacon moved. Beacon did not go for the throat. Beacon went for the wrist, exactly the wrist, exactly where he had been trained to go, and he took the tire iron out of the boy's hand and dropped it in the road and did not close his jaws again. He stood over the fallen iron, ears flat, waiting for the next command, and the boy sat down in the road and put his hands over his face and sobbed like a child. Backup came in 11 minutes. Miriam herself was second on scene. She took the boy in cuffs, gentle, not rough, and she put him in the back of her cruiser and shut the door. And then she came to Grady where he was sitting on the tailgate of a wrecked cruiser with Beacon leaning against his knee. And she looked at him and she said, "Are you hurt?" Grady said no. Miriam said, "Is the girl all right?" Grady said yes. Miriam said, "Is the dog all right?" Grady said, "The dog is fine." Miriam said, "Then I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it. This case is going to try to eat you. You do not let it, do you hear me? You do not let it eat you. You get up in the morning, you feed that dog, you do your job, you come home, and when the trial is done, whatever happens, you come home again the next day, and you do your job again. Because if you let this eat you, they win. All of them. All the way back to 16 years ago. Are we clear?" Grady said. "We're clear." He didn't quite believe her yet. But he heard her again. And this time, it stuck a little deeper. The Ram cruiser was totaled. The boy, whose name was Emmett Halstead, took a plea for aggravated assault and got 2 years. Marjorie's other 2 sons cooperated fully with the prosecution and were not charged. Delphine and Riley moved temporarily into Miriam Cordero's guest bedroom for the 2 weeks before the trial, because Miriam's house was up a long private drive with a gate at the bottom, and Miriam had, as she put it, no patience left for cousins. Grady visited them every evening. He would sit at Miriam's kitchen table under the yellow overhead light and drink decaf and eat whatever her husband Curtis had cooked, and Riley would sit on the rug in the living room with Beacon, and the 2 of them would just be together, quiet, and Grady would watch them out of the corner of his eye and think, "This is the whole story. This is the whole story. This right here." But there was one more thing that hadn't happened yet. Delphine Ashford came to Grady on the porch of Miriam's house 4 days before the trial, and she said she needed to tell him something. Her hands were twisting in the hem of her sweater. Her voice was small. She said, "Officer Lemon, I have to tell you something and I don't want you to hate me for it." Grady put his coffee down. He said, "Mom, I could never hate you." She said, "When Riley disappeared, I did not tell the police everything I knew. I did not tell them that first day about the man with the cats. I did not tell them. I did not tell them for 2 whole weeks. I was ashamed. I told her not to go there, and she went. And I thought if I told them, they would look at me, and they would think I was a bad mother. that I couldn't even keep track of my child. And so I sat in that house and I let people search the river and the woods and the bridges, and I said nothing about the cats. Officer, if I had told them on the first day, would Marcus Kellerman's mother have gotten him back too? Grady sat down on the porch step. Beacon lay down next to him without being told. Grady thought for a long moment about how to answer that, because there was a true answer and there was a kind answer, and they were not the same answer. And Delphine Ashford had asked him with her whole soul, and she deserved the true one. He said, "Ma'am, Marcus Kellerman was gone 2 years and 3 months before your daughter disappeared. 2 years and 3 months. Whatever happened to him happened long before your Riley walked home from softball practice. So no. If you had told us about the cats on day 1, Marcus would still be where we found him. You did not fail, Marcus. You are not the reason he was in that yard. You are not." Then he said, "And I have to tell you the other part too, because if I just told you the first part, you would not believe me the rest of your life. The other part is, yes, we might have found Riley faster. Maybe by day 3 instead of day 15. Maybe. I don't know for sure. But she came home. She's inside that house right now, brushing my dog, and she's alive, and you did that. You called me back. You told me about the caramels. You broke the case for us. Do you hear me? You are the one who broke this, not me. Not Beacon. You. A mother who could not sleep, who told the truth in the end. Delphine put her hands over her face and cried. Beacon got up and walked over to her and pressed his forehead against her knee and stayed there. Delphine cried into his fur for a long time, and after a while she reached down and put her hand on his neck and said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And Grady did not know if she was talking to the dog or to God or to herself, and he did not need to know. The trial started on a Monday. It was held in the county seat, an hour east of Millbrook, in a courtroom with tall windows and old radiators that clanked every 20 minutes. Riley did not testify in person. Riley testified over a closed-circuit video from a small, quiet room with Delphine and Constance, the nurse, beside her. And she was brave, and she was clear, and when the defense attorney asked her in a soft, careful voice, "Are you sure it was Mr. Brenner?" Riley said, "Yes." And the defense attorney did not ask her a second question. He did not dare. Grady testified for 3 hours. Beacon lay on the courtroom floor beside the witness box the whole time, because the judge, a woman named Judge Harkness with silver hair and a face like weathered wood, had said at the start of the trial that if that dog had been good enough to find that little girl, that dog was good enough for her courtroom. Marjorie Halstead testified for the prosecution. She sat in the witness box in a plain grey dress and told the story of a summer 16 years earlier. She did not look at her brother once. Alvin Brenner sat at the defense table with his hands folded and his face empty, and Grady watched him and understood that this was the real Alvin, that all the smiles at the diner had been a costume, and that the empty face was the face underneath. The jury went out on a Wednesday afternoon. The jury came back Wednesday afternoon. It had taken them 90 minutes, guilty on all counts: kidnapping in the first degree, aggravated kidnapping of a minor, murder in the second degree of Louise Marder, murder in the second degree of Marcus Kellerman, and a stack of lesser charges Grady lost track of. Alvin Brenner would not see daylight, as free means, again in his life. The judge said so from the bench in language plain enough that Grady wanted to stand up and applaud. But he did not. He sat in the third row with Beacon at his feet and Miriam Cordero on his left and Delphine Ashford on his right. And when the verdict was read, Delphine put her face against his shoulder and did not lift it for a long time. They drove home in Miriam's car. Miriam drove. Curtis was in the front passenger seat. Delphine and Riley and Grady sat in the back with Beacon across all their laps like a very heavy blanket. Nobody said very much. Riley slept. Delphine looked out the window at the fields going dark and did not cry. There was a peace in the car that Grady did not know how to name. It was not the peace of everything being fine. Marcus Kellerman was still gone. Louise Marder was still gone. Emmett Halstead was still in a state facility. It was the peace, Grady thought later, of something that had needed doing being done. That should have been the end. It wasn't quite. 6 weeks after the trial, on a Saturday morning in early spring, Grady drove out to the Brenner Road on his own time. The tow yard had been condemned. The fences had been cut down. The shed had been demolished. The scrap had been hauled away by trucks from Cleveland. Where the yard had stood, there was now just a bare lot, wet with new grass coming up, and a small stone marker at the far corner, a marker paid for by a fundraiser at Sadie's Diner, and by the elementary school where Delphine worked, and by a Findlay church that had raised money for Marcus Kellerman's mother, and by 132 other people across Ohio who had sent checks with notes on them. The marker had 2 names on it, Louise Marder and Marcus Kellerman. It said, below the names they were found. It said, below that, and they are remembered. Grady stood at the fence line where a fence used to be. Beacon stood beside him. Beacon did not dig. Beacon did not whine. Beacon stood, ears up, watching the field where the shed had been, and after a while, Beacon looked up at Grady and gave a very small, very quiet wag of his tail. Grady bent down. He put both hands on Beacon's neck. He put his forehead against Beacon's forehead. He said, "Thank you, boy. Thank you." Beacon licked his chin once, and then leaned in, warm and solid, and Grady understood something he had not understood before. He understood that a shepherd doesn't lie because a shepherd cannot lie, and that a person, given enough time and enough excuses, can lie a whole life away, and that the world sometimes gets set right not because people are brave, but because a dog will not stop digging when it has smelled the truth. He stood up. He put his hand on his hat. He looked one last time at the small stone marker with the 2 names on it, and he thought about all the mothers and all the small green jackets and all the caramels ever handed to a child at a fence. And he thought about a 19-year-old girl in a summer 16 years ago choosing the wrong thing to protect the wrong person. And he thought about Delphine Ashford picking up the phone on a Thursday morning and telling him the truth she had been afraid to tell for 2 weeks. And he thought about how none of them had done it alone, and how that was probably the whole point of anything worth doing. He walked back to the cruiser. He opened the passenger door. Beacon jumped up onto the seat and turned once and lay down and put his chin on his paws. Grady got in. He started the engine. He looked at the marker one more time in the rearview mirror as he pulled away, and the mirror was the same mirror he had watched the tow yard shrink in on that first rainy afternoon 18 months earlier. And the mist was the same mist, and the road was the same road, and only the world was different because the world had a girl in it who had been in a freezer and was now in the 2nd grade, and because the world had 2 children in it whose names were carved in stone. At last, above the ground. He drove home the long way. He fed Beacon. He sat on his porch and watched the sun go down over the Ohio fields and drank a cold beer, and for the first time since a rainy afternoon 18 months earlier, Officer Grady Lemons slept the whole night through. And in a small yellow house at the other end of Millbrook, a girl named Riley Ashford lay in her own bed for the 8th night in a row, and her mother Delphine sat in the chair beside her, and Delphine watched her daughter breathe, and Delphine let herself, for the first time in 18 months, close her eyes without being afraid. Somewhere out there, in some other town on some other road, another dog was already learning to work. Another officer was already learning to trust the animal at the end of the leash. Another mother was already teaching herself to tell the truth, even when the truth hurt. That was the way of it. That was always the way of it. The world got set right one telephone call and one crooked patch on a green jacket at a time, And it got set right by people who were tired and afraid and did the right thing anyway. And it got set right, more often than anybody in Millbrook, Ohio would ever have guessed, by a shepherd who did not know how to lie.